good afternoon, and good evening to you all, depending on where in the world you are joining us from. My name is David Wellman, and as the director of the Gray School of Applied Diplomacy, it is my pleasure and privilege to welcome you to the second day of our conference, Environmental Diplomacy, Exploring Trans-Professional Contributions to Global Survival. Today, we will begin with a keynote by Robert Dry on the future of state-sponsored environmental diplomacy, followed by a panel engaging the same subject as we move beyond the Paris Agreement. This will be followed by two more panels, one on urban diplomacy and its contribution to environmental sustainability, and a third panel to conclude our day on the subject of diplomacy and the arts in the age of the Anthropocene. We hope that you will be able to attend all of these. At this point, I'd like to turn things over to my colleague, Jeff Wiseman, who will be introducing today's keynote. Jeff?
Thank you so much, David, and hello to everyone. Robert Dry is Adjunct Professor of International Relations at NYU, New York University. Robert is a long-time career US Foreign Service officer who has held postings in Iraq, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, Oman, China, Vietnam, and France. Robert's research interests focus on global environmental governments, US foreign policy in the Persian Gulf, and diplomatic practice. Robert's diplomatic career included his role as economic counselor at the US Embassy in Hanoi, where I once served, in fact, with the goal of completing normalization of relations between the United States and Vietnam in the mid to late 1990s. I should mention that Robert's head of mission, his ambassador, was the inspiring Pete Peterson, a former prisoner of war who was the US's first ambassador to a united Vietnam. Robert also served as a counselor for scientific, environmental, technological, and health affairs at the US Embassy in Paris, during which time he negotiated with the French government the world's largest science project, the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor, which was designed to prove the utility of fusion energy for the 22nd century. Robert has been, I know this for a fact, an active member of the American Foreign Service Association, the diplomats' trade union, if you like, promoting work on ethics in diplomacy. Robert joins us today from Kentucky. Welcome, Robert. Wonderful to see you.
Well, thank you very much. That was a wonderful introduction, and I'm frankly very humbled to be with you all today. I am an avid reader of both Professor Wellman's and Professor Wiseman's works, and they're humbled to be with you. And I do have a paper here, and I'd like to give you the title for it. I refer to Relentless Science and Environmental Diplomacy, How It Meets the New Threat Set. So I am honored to participate in this conference, exploring the connections between diplomacy and the many global environmental challenges, and how these links can be strengthened even more. I thank the many organizers, the Gray School and DePaul University. Special kudos overcoming the strictures imposed by the COVID pandemic. I particularly thank Professor Wellman for inviting me to speak today. What an honor. And this conference could not be more timely. These are times that try men's souls. This country, the United States, all other countries, and even the very planet itself are at risk in novel and frightening ways. We as a species have brought these problems, these calamities upon ourselves. Channeling Greta Thunberg, there is no question that we humans are responsible and to blame for the climate change. The IPCC's most recent report finds climate change brought on by humans to be unequivocal. We have been too slow off the mark in addressing these problems. We must quicken the pace. Now is the time for commitment, optimism, imagination, and innovation. Diplomats can, should, and must play vital roles in facilitating the deep and expansive transformations that lie ahead. I am cautiously optimistic that we can succeed despite all the doomsaying out there. It will, however, take not only renewed faith in global institutions and in multilateralism generally, but also in individuals to take responsibility. everyone at every level in between must commit to do more. An example of this kind of thinking comes to mind during the last administration in the United States act withdrawing the United States from the Paris Agreement. States, cities, communities in the US nonetheless bandied together to implement their own goals to meet the Paris greenhouse gas emission reduction objectives. They, in effect, thumbed their noses at the administration's nihilistic move. These states, cities, and others taking responsible action to fill gaps left by the federal government displayed abundant leadership, initiative, and downright courage. Consider the cumulative diplomacy, the diplomacy of the writ large kind, between actors at all levels, internationally and domestically, seeking to realize that vision. Such action relied not at all on sovereign diplomacy. Rather, it was the transprofessional or citizen diplomacy discussed by many at this conference that led the way. Who knew that cities, NGOs, banks, universities, and philanthropies boasted so many hardy diplomats? California's cap and trade system, which traded carbon credits not only with other US states, but also with the Canadian province of Quebec in an effort to reduce air pollution, provides another example of a case in which a state engages in international environmental diplomacy. In that case, the Trump administration brought suit against California, claiming it had violated the treaty clause of the Constitution and the Foreign Affairs Doctrine by engaging with Quebec. The United States also attempted to argue that California's program was inconsistent with the Trump administration's intent to withdraw from the Paris Agreement at the time. California fought back, and the federal courts agreed with it. Returning to sovereign diplomacy, I am reminded of the time when I served as the country desk officer for Yemen in the Near East Bureau in the Department of State during and following the 1994 Civil War in that country. One of many civil wars in Yemen over the last half century. I was fortunate to have as my ambassador in Sana'a, Ambassador David Newton, a masterful Middle East scholar, diplomat, and Arabist. He was serving his third tour of duty in Yemen at the time. He recounted to me about the days when he first came to Yemen and paid local staff in silver coins, Maria Teresa thalers. Those were the times when human heads were placed on pikes at the entrance to the souk, the marketplace in downtown Sana'a. In another assignment, Newton had served as chargé d'affaires at the US interest section in Baghdad during the Iran-Iraq War. When during that war, the US and Iraq resumed diplomatic relations, that was in 1985, the United States Senate confirmed Newton as ambassador plenipotentiary from the United States to Iraq, extending even longer his time on the ground in war-ridden Baghdad. Yet he never complained. He lived by the creed that diplomats were optimists, that they are foremost communicators and problem solvers. They are anything but strangers, serving as cross-cultural facilitators and bridge builders instead. You've got to work with these great leaders to feel and to be inspired by their presence and drive. And another watchword of diplomacy is commitment itself. During the horrendous post-9/11 long war years, another great American diplomat and former boss of mine, Ryan Crocker, who served as an ambassador to 6 Middle Eastern countries, now counsels young people interested in pursuing careers in diplomacy. He tells them to go to the hard places and do the hard things. In a commencement address at Texas A&M, he told graduating seniors, quote, "Figure out where your comfort zone is, then get outside it." Talk about commitment. And indeed, commitment in addressing the global environmental challenges will be required by everyone, not only sovereign diplomats. And the scale of environmental challenges seems to grow regardless of the yeoman efforts undertaken over half of this last century. When the world first came together at Stockholm for the Conference on the Human Environment, it was in Stockholm that the world came to formally realize that environmental problems were no longer just local and national, but rather transcended borders and reached well beyond national jurisdictions. My country, the United States, the wealthiest on the planet, in recent years has witnessed severe storms, flooding, and devastating fires in ever-increasing numbers and intensity. Glaciers melt into the sea, oceans expand, wetlands recede, and sea levels rise, impacting coastal communities, and with forecasts of greater severity to come. With only a little over 1 degree Celsius of average temperature rise since the beginning of the industrial age, already fragile habitats have become desiccated and species are lost forever. Moreover, pollution seems omnipresent and overwhelming. Recently, one analyst suggested that the weight of plastics in the ocean will outweigh fish stocks themselves unless interventions are taken, and soon. We are at planetary code red. It is as if Rachel Carson's Silent Spring has become reality despite her warnings. Without doubt, science diplomacy will need to play a much greater role to address these and other wicked problems. What other way is there? And diplomats must be at the top of their game. In this country, the Department of State, and frankly, most federal agencies, will need to concentrate like never before on the environmental challenges and how to overcome them. Indeed, in many ways, the rubber has yet to seriously meet the ground. For example, regarding tackling global warming or global heating, or as Thomas Friedman likes to say, global weirding, most countries are still at the aspirational stage of planning what their greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals are. 2030, one milestone, does not seem very far away. More goals are being proposed for mid-century and beyond. Or perhaps expectations for COP26 may be overblown. The session should nonetheless provide a sense of where the world projects itself as to keeping average global temperatures well below 2 degrees Celsius. Pledges to reduce emissions will need to be backed by vast sums of money, to say nothing of the capital to be transferred to developing countries to shore up their mitigation and adaptation goals. And of course, innovation will be a prerequisite. Technology will need to be developed and made available. Entrenched interests will seek relief from the pressures. In short, the energy, transportation, construction, and agriculture and fisheries sectors all will need deep and lengthy transformation to achieve the best possible solutions. Leadership, political will, and science will all need to work together. Necessary change, capital, and political will all seem in short supply. Bon courage to us all. President Joe Biden said in his inaugural UN General Assembly speech only last month, we need, following the end of an altogether too long period of relentless war, to focus efforts to implement a national security strategy of relentless diplomacy, part of the title to my talk today. The president said we need, quote, a collective act of science and political will to address the global challenges of our time. Climate change, pandemics, poverty, pollution, degradations of the biosphere and extinctions, nuclear weapons proliferation, as well as natural resources depletion, are all the kinds of things that the military, however good it is neither trained nor equipped to address. These are the wicked scientific and environmental problems that former Canadian diplomat turned writer and lecturer Darrell Copeland, and I think he's a part of this program this week, has coined as the, quote, new threat set. With most of the world still stuck in the throes of COVID-19 pandemic, we have seen the slow progress of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals actually regress. The world will need to come together to return the SDGs to a healthy trajectory. Moreover, the economies of most countries received COVID gut punches. The United States sees itself possessing a staggering $28 trillion in debt, a depressing example of fiscal irresponsibility by both political parties and executive leadership. Yet in only a couple of weeks, already postponed by a year, world leaders will once more convene in a mega international environmental conference, this time in Glasgow. The occasion is, of course, the 26th Conference of the Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. The UNFCCC, one of the Rio Conventions, was available for signature way back in 1992, following a several-year negotiating period. And it entered into force in 1994, following the required ratifications, including that of the US. Article 2 of the Framework Convention provides that, quote, the ultimate objective of this convention is to achieve stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. As a framework agreement, however, the UNFCCC contained no binding commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That project was left to the implementing protocols. In this case, that was done at Kyoto in 1997. Then Vice President Al Gore led the final US negotiating team, and he signed the agreement for the United States. Meanwhile, back in Washington, Senators Robert Byrd and Chuck Hagel sponsored a resolution, in effect telling the Clinton administration by a margin of 95-0 that it would not ratify the Kyoto Protocol. The resolution explained that mandates for reducing greenhouse gas emissions for the United States were simply too onerous. To satisfy the United States Senate, both Republicans and Democrats at the time, developing countries needed to be treated equally with developed countries, i.e., have the same mandates imposed by them. In their resolution, the senators said they would never ratify an agreement that would harm the US economy. That was one of the lows of our government's reaction to the global environmental governance system. Another low I already lightly touched on was the withdrawal by the United States from the Paris Agreement by the Trump administration, just as the agreement was getting off the ground. The United States essentially took the wind out of the sails of efforts to address global warming. And now the US needs to convince once again the world community that it is serious about tackling global environmental concerns. President Biden will try to move this process forward at the end of the month at both the G20 and the COP26, and the world will be watching. I get ahead of myself. Professor Wellman requested that I speak on what the future trajectory should be of state-sponsored diplomacy to confront the global environmental challenges. Putting this in context, he highlighted that the mission of DePaul University demands consideration of the Vincentian question, what must be done? Importantly, DePaul students are taught this is both a practical and ethical question. And I agree, what must be done is that we need to pull together to address the environmental threats in a way we've not done before. We need to follow the lead of Europe. Europeans are moving in the right direction to address many of the challenges. We also need to follow the advice provided by Pope Francis in his Laudato Si encyclical that he issued in 2015. Much can and should be done to enhance, at least in the United States Foreign Service, the role and the caliber of science and environmental officers, as well as enhance the prestige and clout of the Oceans International Environment and Science, OES Bureau in the Department of State, as well as the position of the Science and Technology Advisor to the Secretary of State, STAS, it's referred to as. But there is no silver bullet to dealing with the wicked problems besetting our and other species and the planet more generally. After all, as John McNeill put it, historian at Georgetown University, the massive environmental degradation facing us now is something new under the sun. Don't take me wrong, I am an optimist, as I have suggested diplomats must be. They are the cross-cultural bridge builders, as Ambassador Newton would say. They can, given political will, find common ground. In many ways, I have found science and technology diplomacy is much easier than some of the more difficult conflict resolution problems that the world faces. Think in that regard of the Middle East peace process. Moreover, my experience as a science diplomat was, I felt, particularly fruitful. I helped advance literally dozens of science agreements, both bilateral and multilateral. In fact, as Professor Wiseman remarked, I worked on the ITER project, which is the most expensive current, largest science project underway in the world today. The idea is to use fusion to create a five-fold increase in energy and capture that energy and use it as power for electrical power plants in 22nd century. In fact, I commend to everyone, particularly the students watching this today, but it can include professors as well, a career in diplomacy, and that includes all its trans-professional manifestations to all students. My foreign service career could not have been more, could have been even more rewarding. During my career, I bumped into many systemic problems over the year at the Department of State and in the US government, and I think they mostly still exist. Many of them still exist in any event. For example, many consider the Department of State to be overly politicized. Some analysts consider it the most politicized agency in the federal government. Take, for example, the vestigial spoil system. The grant of senior ambassadorships to those who raise political campaign contributions needs to be limited, or better yet, eliminated entirely. This pernicious system leads to bad diplomacy, conflicts of interest, and extinguishes incentives for career diplomats to reach higher station. Sadly, in many administrations, the entire top leadership of the Department of State is made up of political appointees only. Moreover, the department is surprisingly resistant to reform and in critical areas remains severely under-resourced. As with criticisms of the US military that it is ready to fight the last war, so it is that the Department of State is ready to refight the Cold War. In my opinion, it remains overly focused on traditional high politics. Policy planning staff is a shadow of what it was in the time of its creation by George Kennan. The Foreign Service Institute, unlike the Department of Defense military college system, needs more depth. In short, long-term planning capability in state goes only so far. More broadly still, of course, there are disturbing deep currents of anti-multilateralism in US foreign policy generally. Neither the environment nor climate change are at the top of the list of concerns in the US, although as an issue, it is getting more attention. These are getting more attention. Perpetual bipartisan rancor in Congress means that it's exceptional to secure 67 votes in the Senate to ratify any treaty of substance, much less one requiring a change in the way we produce energy. As a country, it must appear to the world that we in the United States don't want to give up an iota of sovereignty except in the most limited of circumstances. Fundamentally, we are much too ethnocentric as a nation in the United States. How ironic. As the wealthiest and most powerful country on the planet, the United States should re-engage on these issues in a fully relentless manner, both diplomatically, scientifically, and from the centers of power. The United States has not only an ethical responsibility to do so, because it helped create the many environmental problems, but also because it is in our national security interest to do so. A few days ago, the IMF published in its banner journal Finance and Development an article on COP26 entitled Our Last Best Chance on Climate. The article's subtitle reads a tad more optimistic. The COP26 meeting in Glasgow may usher in a new era of sustainable development. Let us hope that nations and others attending COP26 will indeed come together in a much renewed spirit of cooperation to usher in that new era of sustainable development. sincerely wish President Biden, and indeed all going to Glasgow, much success in meeting the world, in moving the world to a more favorable environmental future. Thank you for your interest and attention in this matter.
Robert, thank you so much for that very thoughtful and I think somber account of where we are at the moment. Again, I think like David and our participants today, I certainly learned a lot from what you had to say about, say, the state perspective, and especially the perspective of the most powerful country on the planet. I wanted to just follow up with one question, Robert, if I may, and that is, as a former professional diplomat myself, I've always been fascinated by the question of the extent to which individual diplomats can have agency, as the academics call it, or wiggle room, as let's say diplomats might call it, in terms of influencing policy in general. What has been your experience with that, but on this issue in particular? So I wondered if you could just address that question, drawing on your own experience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Weissman. So, in my own view, I have always sincerely felt that as a diplomat, as a professional diplomat, you do have an incredible capability to influence Washington policy, and it's the bully pulpit more than anything. The telegrams that are, there's still telegrams that are prepared by professional diplomats can be slugged to or channeled to particular audiences. I sent a number of messages directly. They're called no distribution messages to Secretary of State, then Secretary of State Colin Powell. And I would get separate messages back. Or I would send messages if I was concerned about a matter, describing that matter to a range of federal agencies. You could send them to the National Security Council, you can send them to the White House, you can send them to the Department of State, Department of Defense, you can send them to NOAA. There is this system of communication that allows you to get your ideas out there from a relatively insignificant post or country. You can have an outsized, you can make an outsized impact, but it requires a couple of things, and these are instructive for the students in particular. They have to be well written. They have to be well thought out. They can't sound like they are complaining. They have to be written in such a way that it makes sense to Washington agencies. It makes sense to policy perspective. Going back to Pete Peterson, he was an individual diplomat. He was not a career diplomat as such, although he had been a career Air Force officer and a career national security officer, if you will, having also been a two-term congressman. When he returned to Washington for consultations, he decided not to take up an office in the Department of State in the Bureau of East Asian Affairs. He would ask his former colleagues in the Congress if he could have an office in Congress on Capitol Hill. So he could then spend his time knocking on doors on Capitol Hill, because he knew that that was where he needed to get the support to move the United States to full and complete normalization of relations. He had an incredible impact. He also sent a note to a personal note to every member of Congress and every senator saying, come to Vietnam, visit with me. I will take you around the country. And we had literally hundreds of congressmen and senators come to Vietnam. It made the Vietnamese they were tired of seeing all these senators, but they also realized how important this was. So it was an important way in which he was able to leverage things. I once went to the vice foreign minister in Hanoi together as a note taker with Ambassador Peterson. I don't know if your students all know that most career officers spend a lot of their time just taking notes and writing cables, recording events. It turned out that one of our internal political officers had actually visited a Buddhist monk, and that Buddhist monk was barely tolerated by the Vietnamese government. And he wrote up a report about this. In any event, we were called over to the foreign ministry, and Pete Peterson was handed a diplomatic note, basically saying that we could no longer send our political personnel to visit religious sites without first getting approval from the foreign ministry. And Pete Peterson took that diplomatic note and ripped it in half and threw it back on the desk of the vice minister of foreign affairs. I was astounded because he had, in that very act, he just displayed that I'm not going to do this. You can send me home. You can make me persona non grata, but I am not going to tell my political officer otherwise. He will continue to do his work in this important area. One of my concerns about scientific and environmental officers overseas is that, again, part of the Department of State doesn't necessarily realize how, it still remains divided in many ways between the high politics traditional elements of diplomacy and then the clearly more progressive elements in science and technology. I'll give you a specific, discrete example. The United States was a total leader in the Montreal Protocol on ozone depleting substances, which is considered still to be one of the great achievements of international and global environmental governance. We are seeing, or hopefully that, or NASA sees, that the ozone hole created by these ozone depleting substances is diminishing and should hopefully by the end of the century be back to where it was before we started to use CFCs and HFCs and other ozone depleting substances. So the United States actually, in later years after this convention was in force, just dragged on and dragged on and dragged on the elimination of methyl bromide, which is an ozone depleting substance. And it was used as a fumigant by people in the agricultural world, in the United States in particular. It kills every living thing, flora and fauna in the soils. So then you can plant and particularly seeds that are resistant to this fumigant and grow crops. And it seemed like before every election cycle, the administration or the science and technology folk would say, "Oh, we have this obligation, and we must eliminate the use of methyl bromide." And the political side of the administration would often come back and say, "Yes, but we're worried about the agricultural vote. It makes it very difficult for us, and so we need an exception to this." And of course, there would be back and forth. Senior science officers would say there is an important, we have to lead the way. And then the White House would say, well, sell our policy on this matter and we'll see if we can make progress in the next go round. I be totally frank that when I was in Paris, it was during the W. Bush administration. It was a very difficult time to push back on matters of the environment, the international environment. Obviously, one of the first acts that George W. Bush had done had been to de-sign the Kyoto Protocol, or he wanted to de-sign the Kyoto Protocol, which is almost unheard of in international law, that a country that signs something but doesn't ratify it, nonetheless tries to eliminate or de-sign it. And under the Vienna Convention on Treaties, once a country has signed a treaty, you are bound at least not to argue against it. And the United States was actually in this point of violating the Vienna Convention on Treaties, which is considered to be the international law and treaties. The United States is not a party to the Vienna Convention on Treaties, unfortunately, like it is not a party to a number of other treaties. This is why I think that the United States itself needs to cycle through and change a lot of its attitudes about where science and technology and the environment are in the status of issues. And I think that we are making progress in that regard. Yes, my talk was somber, but I am cautiously optimistic that we are being touched by global climate change. We are getting a much better fix on greenhouse gas emissions around the world through the nationally determined contributions in the Paris system, but also by sensor capability from satellites that are able to see gas plumes or see leakage of methane and other greenhouse gas emissions around the world. I think these are starting to come together much more now than before, and in part because of all of the fires and floods and sea level rise that is occurring. When I was in Paris, one of the biggest issues, and I've lost track of time. I have time?
Fine.
The United States and France, both countries with deep capabilities in international science, in science. French, for example, in the area of nuclear energy or reconditioning or conditioning of nuclear waste, in terms of pharmaceuticals research. The U.S. funding, FDA funding, goes to a lot of French companies because they research a lot of very interesting diseases. The Institut Pasteur and a number of these institutions that go back literally decades and decades are very fine scientific institutions. But what? We didn't have an umbrella science agreement with the French government. All we had was an intellectual property protocol with the French government when I arrived. And I didn't know why we didn't have a full-blown umbrella S&T agreement. So I, together with people in the Oceans International Environment and Science Bureau, got our heads together and started working and offering to negotiate a bilateral agreement with the French government. And the reason was because it was actually a French institution, Institut Pasteur, that had proposed to the US Department of Health and Human Services in around 1980. They believed that they had actually found the HIV virus. And they sent a sample to the US for confirmation by CDC. Well, guess what happened? It was the head of Health and Human Services in the United States took that occasion to say, oh, we have discovered in the United States the HIV virus, and we will have a vaccine within a year or two. And it turned out to be, among other things, not just who discovered this was important, and it always is important in science, but who would get the royalties? Because it was having discovered the virus led to the kit that was used to determine whether someone had contracted this disease or not. This became the premier bilateral problem between our two countries. And just as when I was in Paris from 2004 to 2008, the Kyoto Protocol implementation was a huge problem for the French, because French companies were having to address or deal with this extra cost of carbon credits, whereas US companies were not. And the French government even proposed saying, well, we're going to implement a border tax on US goods coming into our country because your companies are not subject to this. So what we ended up doing, among other things, was really beefing up the bilateral science piece. And the French were very interested in getting on working with our agencies, our NOAAs, our USGS and others, and interested in a new bilateral science agreement. So I helped negotiate the latest version of bilateral science agreement with the French government that included included an element whereby it required science agencies of both countries to get together at least once a year to discuss what were the collective the priorities between the two countries, so they could work together. And they would compare. So the French government might have some research vessels that go into the polar regions. The United States didn't, but polar researchers in the United States might want to use those vessels. We got all those things together. And I brought over one of the Office of the Legal Advisor experts. We had the agreement totally signed in the U.S. government through the U.S. government. I had it on treaty paper in my safe. I had the National Science Foundation head coming over to sign it during the last visit of George W. Bush. So it would be one of the deliverables. Well, George W. Bush's advance team said, not interested, not interested. We want instead to celebrate, the 40th or 50th anniversary or whatever it was of the end of the Second World War. And I argued back to our government saying, look, this is a future kind of thing. The French government are very suspect about the United States in so many ways. It would be wonderful to have a future, a full. It turned out that the Bush administration never did sign that agreement. The head of NOAA actually signed an implementing protocol once that bilateral agreement was in place, so that it would come into effect whenever the overall umbrella actually was signed by the two countries. And it took until 6 months into the new Obama administration for us, for the United States government to sign that agreement with the French government. So there are institutional issues going forward. I think most science and technology and environmental officers are really progressive, really interested in trying to push things forward. And they have some wiggle room, they can argue. I just saw that a news clip saying that the U.S. embassy in Rome, now there's actually a tri-embassy. It's, they have 3 ambassadors and U.S. ambassadors in Rome. They're working on greening the U.S. missions in Rome. I tried the exact same thing. I tried within, and I don't know if you know the U.S. embassy in Paris. It was the first purpose-built embassy, and it's right on Place de la Concorde. And it's very difficult to green that because it was built in 1928 or something like that. But I argued that our ambassador needed talking points, and one good talking point would be if we had a green embassy, if we just changed the light bulbs, if we recycled more, if we did something around. And it was very difficult to sell that internally in the embassy. I was actually very surprised because I really had thought that was a slam dunk. Now, nowadays, I think you can do that. And certainly under this administration, you can. Under the last administration, probably not. So much does depend. I think that there is wiggle room. There are things that individual ambassadors or individual foreign service officers can do that can make a difference. I think you can deploy a lot of initiative if you are articulate. You can get an audience. When I was in China, there was a political officer who was just devoted to talking about. I was in China before, during, and after Tiananmen. But there was a political officer who really understood the power struggle between Li Peng and Zhao Ziyang, and had developed essentially a readership back in Washington. So there was this comment, on every cable that went to Washington, not only sending back kudos, but asking for more and reading this material, really showing that you can change policy through the power of the ability to write a very good cable. I hope some of that helps.
Robert, yes, indeed, more than that. Look, thank you so much for sharing all of those reflections. I think you have, amongst other things, helped many of us demystify the world of diplomacy and what diplomats actually do on the ground. And obviously, it's much more complex and subtle than many people on the outside would imagine. And I think your stories and anecdotes just now, I think, testify to that claim. So thank you very much for all of those wonderful thoughts. And I'm sure we'll find that people will come back to your comments and thoughts in subsequent sessions. I'm going to have a look at the time now and turn back over to David to see how he wanted to manage our time in drawing this session to a close, giving people a break, ready for the next session. David, over to you.
Well, I would just like to express my gratitude to Mr. Dry for an extremely thoughtful and nuanced talk. And thank you so much for joining us today. It's such an honor to have you with us. And at this point in time, I think that we should take a break, and we're going to return at the top of the hour for panel 3, State-Sponsored Environmental Diplomacy Beyond the Paris Agreement. And that will begin at the top of the hour. So we look forward to seeing you in about 11 minutes.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.
A pleasure.
Bye-bye.